In this video, you will learn about section 4-4 of factoring out the greatest common factor of an expression. First, let's review a couple important definitions. The greatest common factor is the common factor of the terms with the greatest coefficient and the greatest variable exponent. And you can factor any expression that has a GCF not equal to 1. In order to determine the greatest common factor of a set of numbers, you should list all of the possible factors of each number and determine the largest number that is a factor of both of those numbers. So in our first example, it says determine the greatest common factor of 24 and 28. First, I want to list the factors of each. So if I want to rewrite your factors of 24, I'm going to go through and figure out all the numbers that's divisible by it. So if I do 24 divided by 1, I would get 24. 24 divided by 2 would give me 12. 24 divided by 3 would give me 8. And 24 divided by 4 would give me 6. Now if I were to divide 24 by 5, I get a decimal. And now if I look, I already have done 6, so I don't need to list any more. Now for 28, I want to list all the factors of 28. So if I divide 28 by 1, I get 28. If I do 28 divided by 2, I would get 14. If I do 28 divided by 3, it gives me a decimal, so I don't include it. If I do 28 divided by 4, it would give me 7. And if I do 28 divided by 5, it gives me a decimal. And 28 divided by 6 gives me a decimal, and then I'm back to 7. You only want to include the numbers that give you whole numbers, and you can use your calculator to help you through this process. Now, if we look, the greatest common factor is the number that's the biggest number that is included in both of these. And the biggest number that's included in both of our set of factors is 4. So the GCF, or the greatest common factor, is 4. Now let's talk about the steps to factor a greatest common factor out of an algebraic expression. First, you want to determine the greatest common factor of the coefficients. You're going to rewrite each of the terms as the greatest common factor times the other factor times the variables. Then you will cross out all of the common factors and write it outside the parentheses. And then lastly, fill in the remaining numbers and variables inside of each of the parentheses. So in our first example, it says factor the common factor out of each expression, and we have 40x and 16. First, I want to figure out what's the greatest common factor of 40 and 16. So if I list the factors of 40, I want to go through and list all of them. If I do 1 divided by 40, I get 40. 2 divided by 40 will give me 20. 40 does not divide by 3. If I divide 40 by 4, I would get 10. 40 divided by 5 will give you 8. You can't divide 6 into 40, you can't divide 7 into 40, and then we're back to 8. Now for 16, if I do 16 divided by 1, I get 16. 16 divided by 2 gives you 8. 16 and 3 don't divide, and then 16 divided by 4 gives you 4. So the greatest common factor between these two sets of numbers is 8. Now I want to rewrite each of my terms and separate them out. So my original terms were 40x and negative 16. And notice I'm maintaining those original signs. I can rewrite 40x as, I know that 40x is positive. My greatest common factor is 8, so I'm going to have positive 8. And for 40, 8 divides by 5. So I have positive 8 times 5, and then I have an x attached. For 16, it was negative 8 was my greatest common factor. When I divided 16 by 8, I got 2. and there's no variables. Now, the greatest common factor is 8, and the only thing that matches up here is this 8. So I can cross out this 8 and write it in front. Now I'm going to be left with whatever's not crossed out. So it'll be positive 5x and negative 2. And that would be your final answer. For our next example, we want to do the same process of finding all of our common factors. So if I do 25 divided by 1, I would get 25. 25 divided by 2 is a decimal. 25 divided by 3 is a decimal. 25 divided by 4 is a decimal. And 25 divided by 5 would give you 5. For 20, 20 divided by 1 gives you 20. 20 divided by 2 gives you 10. 20 divided by 4 gives you 5. And we're back to the beginning. Now looking at this, our greatest common factor in this case is 5. So I want to rewrite my terms as a product of the greatest common factor. So I have negative 25 b squared and 20b. Now the negative 25b squared, I'm going to keep the negative. We know that our greatest common factor is 5, so I have negative 5, and when I divide 25 by 5, I get times 5, and since it's b squared, this means that this b is 2 times. So it's going to be times b times b. For 20b, it's positive. I know my greatest common factor is 5. When I divide that 20 by 5, I get 4, and I only have one b. So I'm going to write down a singular b. Now, the things we have in common is I have a 5 and I have a b. So I can take out a 5b, and I'm left with negative 5b from the first part of the expression and plus 4 from the second part. In our final example, now we have a trinomial, so we have to consider 3 different possibilities. So I want to figure out what are all the factors of 6. So if I do 6 divided by 1, I get 6. 6 divided by 2 gives me 3, and that gives me all my possibilities. For 27, I have 1 and 27. 27 doesn't divide by 2. If I do 27 divided by 3, I get 9. 27 doesn't divide by 4, 27 doesn't divide by 5, and 27 doesn't divide by 6, and 27 doesn't divide by 8, so these are all my factors. And for our last one, if I have 3, 3 divided by 1 gives me 3, and 3 is not divisible by 2. So looking at all the possibilities here, the greatest common factor would be 3. Now if I rewrite each of my terms, the first one is 6x squared. The next one is 27x. And the last one is 3. Now if I want to rewrite 6x squared, I'm going to write it's a positive 6. My greatest common factor is 3. The other number is 2. And since it's x squared, that means there's 2 times for x's. So it's times x times x. For 27x, I'm going to rewrite it's positive. The greatest common factor is 3. When I do 27 divided by 3, from up here I get 9, and this means that there's only one x. Our last one is 3 is positive. The greatest common factor is 3, and when I divide by 3, I get 1. And there's no variable, so I leave that part blank. Now I want to cross out all of my greatest common factors. So in this case, there's a 3 in every single one of these. So I can factor out a 3, and then I'm left with positive 2, it's x squared, because there's 2 x's, plus 9x plus 1. Notice that even though I factored out the 3, I have to leave that 1 there to represent that it's a part of the expression.